All right, today we're going to be reading Chapter 2 of Jean Baudrillard's Fatal Strategies, titled Figures of the Transpolitical, which basically amounts to his summary and sober critique of contemporary society and the way that we're holding on to vestiges of past ways of being, of dialectical reasoning, of history as a rational process, of certain idealized forms of progress or of conflict, which are in essence preventing us from figuring out how to find our footing in this new world that we find ourselves in. So this second chapter is considerably more difficult than the first one. It is a lot more metaphorical and playful at times, and he's basically laying out a couple of figures, so to speak, which represent the transpolitical, which is basically the point at which we are at. There's the idea of postmodernism is beyond the modern, or in a sense rebels against or denies some of the presumptions of modernism. This transpolitical is basically going to forsake some of the rules of the political, and it's going to make for a very different way of understanding what it means to be social, for example. And Baudrillard says that the transpolitical is the mode of appearance of all. He says it's the saturation of systems that brings them to their point of inertia. The equilibrium of terror and deterrence, the orbital round of floating capital, H-bombs, information satellites, and of theories themselves floating, satellites of an abstract referential. And that notion of an abstract referential pretty well sums up the problem, which is that we are floating around these abstract notions of value, of exchange, of progress, of equality, which he is going to problematize here when he talks about what are the kind of figures that this transpolitical creates, which is to say, what is the kind of people it makes us be. And the first of these figures is the obese. And we have to keep in mind that at some times he does mention obesity in the literal sense, the kind you find all over the U.S., that kind of monstrous conformity to empty space. And he defines this obesity, which, of course, this is a metaphorical obesity in a sense of a saturation. He calls it deformity by excess of conformity, that translates the hyperdimension of a sociality at once saturated and empty. And that's one of the important elements here, is that, and you'll find this in Foucault's writing too, is as society progresses, we have this call for progress, for being informed, for visibility, for example. And Baudrillard sees this especially being played out in the media, for example, where we have this hyperdimension of society, this virtual realm of the media space, which is, and this is certainly a feeling everyone will get when they watch the news today, that it is so saturated and yet completely empty. It's as if sometimes things are not really being said, and sometimes really important things can be said, and yet they prompt a sense of apathy within us. And Baudrillard says that this obese form is the secret form of the mirror by which the body watches over itself and its image is abolished, yielding to the unrestrained redundancy of a living organism. No more limits, no more transcendence. It is as if the body was no longer opposed to an external world, but sought to digest space in its own appearance. And this is essentially a problem that we see throughout postmodern philosophy, is that oftentimes what we consider a form of individualism, of being free to one's individual person, is actually a rather coerced notion of participation in a social order. And Baudrillard is going to point out how that participation comes in the form of an imperative, which essentially stultifies us. It bores us to death, basically. And this obese form, quote unquote, again, this hypersaturated sort of form, he calls hypertrophied cellular tissue proliferating in all directions. So, right, we're beyond all limits. Think about markets, for example. They are growing faster and faster, burgeoning with greater rapidity. We have this global market that includes, quote unquote, third world countries and buys wholesale pre-made items and puts a logo on them and then sells them to people for jacked up prices that just becomes the norm. So this idea of the norm in this maximum state of proliferation, of expansion, the norm becomes rather fleeting. The norm changes faster and faster, like culture today. And Baudrillard says that this leads to, quote, a fatal obesity, primal and placental, as if they were pregnant with their own bodies but could not be delivered of them. The body grows and grows without being able to deliver itself. But also a secondary obesity, the obesity of simulation in the image of present systems, bloated with information they can never deliver. The obesity characteristic of operational modernity, in its frenzy to store and memorize everything, to pass in the most total uselessness to the very limits of the inventory of the world and of information, and in the process to set up a monstrous potentiality for which there is no representation possible, which can no longer even be put into play. So basically what we've got going on here is we have this notion of, this kind of metaphorical obesity takes its form in the notion of the worker today. And the worker is extremely individualized. We have technological means by which to surveil each worker and his progress, and is he or she meeting their goals? Are they optimized in the way they work? I think of Amazon employees who are being deducted their paychecks for going to the bathroom because it reduces productivity. There's this sense in which we have a hyper-individualization of each worker, which optimizes them into essentially an instrument of labor. They become a form of capital, which gets circulated in a market. And the producers also turn into a produced commodity to be optimized, to be worked on. But in this hyper-individuality, we basically have complete abstraction, complete ambiguity. No worker is really a person in the sense of being valued for their personal dignity, quote unquote. And Baudrillard is not trying to appeal to that. He's not trying to say we need to get back to some sort of dignity. But what he's saying is when we invoke these forms, often for progress of, well, how can we make workers' lives better? How can we get back this humanity? In a sense, that is going to be used to continually engorge this obese notion of you can't be put into play. You have very little agency in the modern workplace. And this leads to just an obsession of storing and memorizing information in the case of data mining and stuff like this, and trying to know lots of information about every single worker. And they're essentially bloated with something they can never deliver. Because think about the optimization process continues to accelerate, and you have to get more and more optimized ad infinitum, and there's no limit. And this constitutes a unique situation which Baudrillard calls a sociosphere of contact, control, persuasion, and dissuasion, of exhibition of inhibitions in massive or homeopathic doses. Have a problem? We solve it. This is obscenity. All structures turned inside out and exhibited, all operations rendered visible. And this is something we get in Foucault too, when Foucault looks at the panopticon, which is a circular prison model in which basically there's a central tower which can view every single prisoner at all times, but there's only a one-way visibility. The prisoners can't know if they're being watched. They can't see if they're being watched, but there's the possibility that they could be being watched all the time. And this notion of maximal visibility basically makes for maximum invisibility. You become invisible as a rational human subject, but you rather become an instrument of some kind of process. And he points out, Baudrillard does, the idea of like homeopathy, of, well, we've got a solution for every problem. And that is the real problem, is assuming that everything needs to be solved, that everything needs to be made visible. And Baudrillard mentions that the social, once the mirror of conflict, class, and the proletariat, finds its definitive hypostasis among the handicapped. Historical contradictions have taken the pataphysical form of mental or physical deficiency. So we've got this obsession with deficiency today, right? With mental illness, of everyone self-diagnosing themselves as if everything was a problem that needed to be fixed. And in doing this, really absence no longer becomes possible. You are always forced to be present in a way, and you're basically obligated to be as bloated with information and become as optimized as possible. And Baudrillard points out that basically the way a subject is treated in the contemporary world is as if it was a cancer which had an imperative to proliferate. He says, with cancer, it's a matter of an esoteric reaction. The body rebels against its own internal organization, undoes its own structural equilibrium. It's as if the species had had enough of its own definition and had thrown itself into an organic delirium. And this basically makes for a situation in which society becomes this imminent outpacing of all forms. It's a question of accelerating, of going faster and faster, of what are the norms and rules of the market, and how can we break them to become more profitable. And this leads us to a peculiar situation, which is basically extremes without opposition. Baudrillard says, the obese is also in a total delirium, for he is not only large, of a size opposed to normal morphology. He is larger than large. He no longer makes sense in some distinctive opposition, but in his excess, his redundancy, his hypieniality. It's a new word for you. And this is basically a situation in which, because Baudrillard doesn't buy this notion of history as a dialectical process, that contradictions will sublate themselves, will reconcile themselves, and history is this rational unfolding towards this utopian state, towards this idealized utopian state. Instead, we have basically a process in place. We have this extension beyond all limits, which obviously plenty of people will recognize this as a form of delirium, as a sort of obscenity that lives off outpacing all rules. Now, it must be pointed out that this is not necessarily bad. This has the potential to work for some revolutionary means. And it's really interesting to see the way that his analyses connect with Deleuze and Guattari, for example. And they're both responding to a similar situation, which is, you have things like capital, which thrive on basically outpacing their own destruction by warding off death. And by doing this, they give rise to these obese forms, as Baudrillard would put it. And when we get to these forms, our traditional binaries start to break down. It's no longer small or large, it's too much, right? People are killing themselves all the time because it's too much. And he kind of puts this in a funny way, which feels a little conservative sometimes. I'm always on the fence of when is Baudrillard showing his conservatism and when is he like super radically lefty. But he says, in so doing, porn makes sexuality appear superfluous. That is what is obscene. Not that there is too much sex, but that sex is too much. What makes the obese obscene is not that there is too much body, but that the body is superfluous, de trop. And again, this is the problem of a passage to the limit that caricatures reality, turns it into an empty copy of a defamed original. And Baudrillard is not trying to look for this original. He's not doing a conservative move of, oh, we've turned away from these values. No, Baudrillard, and if you watch the last video, which I would recommend, in which we talked about the first chapter, Ecstasy and Inertia, he points out that we're not trying to get back, but we are trying to figure out how do we situate ourselves in a completely new way of doing things. Now, in this second figure of the transpolitical, we have the hostage. And here, Baudrillard is talking about terrorism. And he's basically trying to point out that what is at work in terrorism, just like the case with prisons and discipline for Foucault, is this is essentially a outgrowth of a deeper societal change that is occurring at the interstices between people, the kind of things that we tacitly accept. And he wants to see the hostage in the case of terrorism as in a state of virtual extermination. Baudrillard says he's no longer a victim at all, since he is not the one who dies. He merely answers for the death of another. His sovereignty is not even alienated. It is congealed. So, right, we've got this situation where the hostage stands in for some larger symbolic event, and somehow the hostage is supposed to answer for something larger. And there's this insistence on answering for things, right? People get indignant, and the Taliban comes in and makes people answer for their crimes. There's this obsession with justice, which just turns into this complete caricature in the case of the Taliban. Like, women aren't allowed in parks. You have this totally archaic justice system in the middle of the 21st century that just, it doesn't belong. And the Taliban, a very antiquated system of governance, is basically trying to fight its own superfluity. And in that situation, it's basically these last vestiges of you need to account for what you've done, right? And the US has to account for what they've done. But Baudrillard points out that some of the things that we see in terrorism, that we see as opposing our quote-unquote normal ways of life, are in fact a part of what constitutes the political milieu we're in. Baudrillard says, in nuclear strategy, civilian populations and great urban centers are used as hostages by military high commands. Their death and destruction serve as a dissuasive argument. Right, just like Baudrillard talked about in the last chapter, dissuasion is the name of the game. It's making stuff happen without actually making it happen. It's being in that state of high alert of kind of, during World War II when there was all this training for gas masks in like elementary schools and stuff like that. The fear of the nuclear bomb, it almost equaled the level of the nuclear bomb, and arguably the fear becomes even greater after we have these symbolic acts like the bombing of Hiroshima, which of course is not to say that it's not a real act, that stuff didn't actually take place. No. Baudrillard, though, is trying to point out the conceptual level of this analysis of, okay, what is this trying to mean? Because obviously this is a form of disciplining the Axis powers in general, of dissuading. And just by giving this little glimpse, it creates this deterrent situation, which Baudrillard says, we are all hostages. We all now serve as dissuasive arguments, objective hostages. We answer collectively for something, but for what? So there's really something that is not in our hands anymore that we are constantly having to fight against, which is some sort of imminent evil which drives progress. And this is not necessarily progress in the quote-unquote good sense. This is just, for example, in U.S. politics and British politics today, especially. I'm not super familiar with other political situations, but we have this situation in which it's basically a deterrent modality that decides how we vote of, well, if this guy goes in, all this bad stuff is going to happen. So I know you don't like this other guy at all. And they basically fight with the same team. They both paint with the same colors, but we have this symbolic difference that upholds this sense of representation, which, of course, I think more and more I'm inclined to believe Muammar Gaddafi that representation is a fraud. But Baudrillard points out that the cataclysmic result of this is that, quote, we now live in a state of permanent suspense and emergency whose symbol is the nuclear bomb. Objective hostages of a savage God. We don't even know what event, what accident will touch off the ultimate manipulation. So, right, we've got this catastrophic sense of shit is going to go down, right? Of something crazy is going to happen in the imminent future. We've got ecological crises, which, yes, they are things which are ahead of us, but they serve these very complex political goals. And this is not to say we shouldn't be worried about the environment, although I'm sure you could probably read Baudrillard and say that he's not as attuned to these real catastrophes that are, he emphasizes the symbolic dimension a lot and maybe at the detriment of the real dimension. But I think his point is, just like he mentioned in the last chapter, that the announcement of a nuclear bomb going off, it was estimated based on all this complex analyses that the sense of upheaval that would result from that would be greater than the destruction of the atomic bomb itself. That in a sense, the symbolic becomes more detrimental than the real. And to kind of highlight the connection between terrorism and kind of our normal way of life, Baudrillard says, but if you think about it, terrorism is only the executioner for a system which itself also seeks both total anonymity and, at the same time and contradictorily, total responsibility for each of us. With the death of anyone, it executes the sentence of anonymity that is henceforth ours, that of the anonymous system, anonymous power, the anonymous terror of our real lives. The principle behind extermination is not death, but rather statistical indifference. So, right, this milieu which is allowing terrorism to come about and allowing it to be treated in the way it is, to serve these complex political means, is because of a way in which society treats people with a statistical indifference, with, oh, each of you has a responsibility to live, and if you don't, that needs to be atoned for with retaliation against the Taliban or ISIS or something like this, as if they constituted a real force and weren't rather more of a precedent to establish further U.S. hegemony in the Middle East, for example. But in contrast to this, and really at the same time as this need for responsibility, quote unquote, for mattering to the state, we have the fact that the state essentially operates by total anonymity towards us. You usually aren't, just in the case of school, you aren't really treated as an individual unless you messed up and you're getting punished. I like to think about the fact that in like high school, for example, the kids that were getting the most attention from teachers or that had the most complex relationships with their teachers, that knew the most stuff about their teachers, that got along with their teachers the best oftentimes was those who were like failing all their classes. So the teacher had to add all this extra attention to them. And Baudrillard says, while asking ourselves about the monstrosity of terrorism, we should perhaps ask ourselves if it does not really derive from a proposition of universal responsibility, itself monstrous and terrorist in its essence. That's a bold claim. And this is basically an anti-liberal, post-humanist kind of claim. That the aversion to terrorism is sympathetic of a universal responsibility, which is actually completely ambiguous. It's not actually an individual responsibility. It's an individualizing, organizing responsibility. It cellularizes one and puts one in a place in a social system, and basically gets us to look at terrorism as this sort of spectacle which hides from the essentially simulacral form of terrorism that floats through society. Baudrillard says, our paradoxical situation is this. Because nothing any longer has meaning, everything should work perfectly. That's a quote in and of its own to represent capitalism. There's no longer any rules, except this abstract notion of optimization to a system that's always outpacing itself. And he goes on to say that every anomaly must be justified and every irregularity must find its guilty party, its criminal link. This too is terror and terrorism, this hunt for responsibility without any common measure with the event, this hysteria of responsibility that is itself a consequence of the disappearance of causes and the almighty power of effects. And this is an important notion that plays in both Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari's analyses of popular historical events. Baudrillard did this with the Gulf War, and Deleuze and Guattari did this with May 68, which is to say they did not take place. And this is not saying they weren't real events that really happened, but the notion of taking place, of something being a homogeneous historical entity which can basically be reduced to some causal relation, that is what is being poked fun at here. And in this kind of terrorist language, so to speak, that Baudrillard is pointing out, where everything has to be accounted for, nothing can be an anomaly, everything has to make sense in some sort of operationalized political order, we basically have this reductive historiography of reducing things to causes and effects, as if it was that simple. And really, this is a way of objectifying things that don't necessarily, right, they're events, they're not objects, and events don't necessarily, because they operate in the symbolic domain as well, they're not purely causal. There's a little bit of ambiguity, which is essentially the power that Baudrillard wants to point out. And this is a point that Baudrillard has made in Symbolic Exchange and Death, which was what is essentially going on today is not a value of life. I think about these right to life movements, but rather it is a subjectification of life, of, as Baudrillard puts it, it's about having a timely death. Baudrillard speaks of programs for the prevention of accidental death by systematic and organized death. That is our monstrously logical situation. The death systems put an end to death as an accident. So again, accidents are essentially unacceptable to contemporary society, where everything has to add up, where death has to be made accountable in some sort of liberal reasoning of this infinite proliferation of justice, which obviously this sort of rhetoric works for imperialist means today to expand into places where, for example, the US doesn't belong on the grounds of freedom and democracy. which of course is basically this operational signifier. It's basically this abstract notion, which of course doesn't even really mean anything when we look at the historical situation, even within the United States, of essentially this alienation which Baudrillard is talking about, which really only serves the system's means itself. And Baudrillard says that is what the equilibrium of terror means. The world is held collectively responsible for the order that reigns there. If anything were to come dangerously close to infringing this order, the world would have to be destroyed. And from where could it be done more efficiently than from those places outside the world, from satellites and bombs in orbit? From there, definitively no longer a territory, all territories are ideally neutralized and held hostage. We have become the satellites of our satellites. So, territory takes on a rather idealized notion when we think about virtual spaces, for example, when we think about the internet, when we think about drone strikes, which are occurring via computers from hundreds of miles away, in which suddenly the territory becomes an orbitalized concept. It is deterred from the outside, from all sides. And yet this outside is part of the system, right? People, governments especially, own the satellites that orbit around the globe and that operate to give us things we love, like telecommunications, and things we abhor, like nuclear weapons. Now, granted, I'm not actually sure there are nuclear weapons in orbit right now. I think that's an illegality, but nevertheless, there are weapons which are in space, and that is an important notion to take hold of. And this is going to lead to an undercurrent that is in a lot of kind of 68 theory, as it's kind of been called, of these May 68 philosophers who were kind of the French theorists in and around May 68. And it's basically this mandatory subjectivity. It's that individuality, that hyper-individuality, which is simultaneously ambiguous, that Baudrillard has been talking about. He says, even including our own identity, whose hostages we are, called upon to assume it, to answer for it with our own lives. This is called security, occasionally social. Called on to be ourselves, to talk, delight, realize ourselves, under pain of what? A provocation. Provocation, unlike seduction, which allows things to come into play and appear in secret, dual and ambiguous, does not leave you free to be. It calls on you to reveal yourself as you are. It is always blackmail by identity, and thus a symbolic murder, since you are never that, except precisely by being condemned to it. And this is perhaps one of Baudrillard's strongest points, which is that we have this sense of security, which is basically the last vestiges of the state, which Baudrillard points out often we are put in this sense of feeling like we need security precisely because of the deterrent methods taken by the state, of the acceleration of the possibility of nuclear warfare, right? The amassing of nuclear weapons and the deterrence, which is used as basically a progressive dog whistle to act like this is going away, like we aren't deterring, that there is this feeling of security which is defining society. And often today, I think especially with discussions of identity politics, security is seen as residing within the self. And the self, that bodily autonomy, that's an especially important term today around abortion debates, is we feel like we are owed this sense of bodily autonomy, which of course, we want freedom, right? We want liberty. But Baudrillard wants to point out how this is being co-opted by a system which is basically mandating that you have an identity, and more precisely, that you have an identity which can integrate into society, which can get rid of the secret or seduction. And the secret and seduction are two of Baudrillard's fatal strategies, essentially. They are ambiguous. They work by messing with the operational logic of society, by working with the terms, but by shifting the way they relate, and in so doing, creating a truth more profound than truth, in a sense, which that really only makes sense if we're talking about truth in the Baudrillardian sense. But there's this demand to integrate, to be involved, which of course is made more and more impossible not to acquiesce with the onset of information technology and the internet, which essentially compels one to be involved in society, right? And it's a whole new sort of society with the onset of the internet and the way that operationalizes us, and the way, I mean, you want to talk about class struggle, for example. Class struggle completely changes when we get on the internet, and the question of labor becomes completely different because our very existence becomes a form of free labor, which can be used, for example, on various websites to act as something which these sites can profit off of by putting ads on their sites. And just you existing is a form of labor. You literally become an operationalized subject, and essentially a question of maximization. But what happens here is there is a demand to realize ourselves, right? Find our true self. I think this is definitely the reason that we have kind of a new agey undercurrent within society today, which is that we've fallen for this really unidimensional notion of, oh, the powerful are over there and they're alienating us and they're preventing us from rising up. But Baudrillard, as well as Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault, for example, are pointing out that, well, it's not that easy, because what we take to be the most overt sources of power, or the most overt senses of terror or of domination, such as that of the Taliban or ISIS, are in fact symptoms of something that's already taken place and that is proliferating and multiplying within society. And this essentially creates a imperative which becomes a provocation of, you must find your true self. You must get back to that unalienated self, which essentially does not leave one to be free, because that notion of your real self, I mean, that's such a problematic notion in and of itself. Really, read Deleuze and Guattari's critique of, for example, Freudian psychoanalysis to see some of the problems with that. It essentially hinges on these idealized notions of what the subject ought to be, of what plagues every subject, of the human condition, quote unquote. But this notion of what the subject ought to be is a politically infused notion. You are not free when you are, a member of society, in a sense. And this is why he's saying that we are hostages, in a sense. That it is a blackmail that occurs just by the imperative, which becomes a provocation, to inhabit an identity, to be driven by that identity, which of course doesn't just exist. Like, people know that with all sorts of identity labels, like incel, for example, which carry with them a number of connotations of political interaction, and really complicates any notion of what it would even mean to get back to that sense of self. Baudrillard says, more commonly, we are all in this way hostages of the social. If you don't participate, if you don't manage your capital, money, health, desire, if you're not social, you destroy yourself. This Baroque idea of taking oneself hostage in order to have one's demands met is not so singular. This is the act committed by madmen, quote unquote, who hole up and resist to the death. And that notion of to the death is important, because if we think about, for example, the creation of the idea of madness, it's basically a denial of madness in the rational subject. of the people who are normal as opposed to those people over there, which essentially amounts to a weasel word of the other. This essentially turns into, especially as ideas of mental illness and madness and schizophrenia and ADHD, as these become sort of a mass phenomenon of self-realization of, oh, I was sick all along and blah, blah, blah will help me, whatever that might be. It's essentially a resistance to death, insofar as a resistance to the notion of an absolute limit like death that cannot be surpassed by this optimization of society. I mean, think about how we're trying to extend life expectancy and stuff like this, and cryogenic chambers, right, which essentially, it's such an ironic concept because it is essentially life extended ad infinitum. You know, life is change and living, but by freezing it, by putting it into cryogenic sleep, which essentially speaks to the stultifying image of identity today, of a life which is essentially frozen in a circulation, right? There is no trajectory except the circular. And this essentially amounts to a resistance to death and leads one to simply function, to simply plug in somewhere. And it just becomes obscene as Baudrillard sees it. And Baudrillard points out, for example, the relationship of the media here, the media's mediation of terrorism, which the idea of media as mediators, I mean, they are mediators, but they are equally producers in and of themselves. But not producers in the sense of they make up the narrative, but in the sense of they are essentially responsible for recycling the narrative, of making this link between the viewing subject on the other side of the screen and the deliverer of the content, which in a sense, I mean, especially with the notion of fake news today or mis/disinformation, it is clear that the delivering of information is not an innocent process. It can definitely be seen as a mode of production. But Baudrillard says, it is said that without the media, there would be no terrorism. And it is true that terrorism does not exist in itself as an original political act. It is the hostage of the media, just as they are hostages to it. There is no end to this chain of blackmail. Everyone is the hostage of the other. This is the end of our so-called social relation. Besides, there is another factor behind all of this, which is something like the womb of this circular blackmail, the masses, without which would be neither media nor terrorism. And Baudrillard is going to point to this throughout, that we've got these contributions in philosophy which are pointing out that things are related in a social field. We could think of this as discourse analysis, as laid out by Foucault, for example. But this also exists in assemblage theory, for example. And Baudrillard is pointing out that, that's good. This is a sense of getting behind the subjectivity of the real world. But Baudrillard is problematizing that notion of the real world because we essentially have all these processes and all these senses of meaning, which Baudrillard sees as bound up in nothing but a circular process of adaptation and outpacing limits. And this is mediated by a sort of muddy or fuzzy aggregate, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it, a muddy conception of this social field as the masses. It's the social taken to its limit. And it's sort of like Heidegger's Das Man, the they, of we eat, drink, and judge literature as they do so. We shrink from the great mass as they shrink back, right? It's this ambiguity which defines what it means to exist socially, which is in a sense alienated to something which, and this is Baudrillard's point, we are alienated to something that does not exist. In the sense of the social or the masses is not some homogeneous entity. It's not some homogeneous subject, which, like, he's not the only guy to say this. But he does point out that this notion of the social, of the masses, something which is often seen as a recourse of sorts, of helping us penetrate into these processes. I think Baudrillard is trying to point out that really this just tells us something that we already knew, I think, that we're in essentially a womb that is circulating, and we're really stuck in this discursive process of Baudrillard is trying to point out, like, there is no reality, quote unquote. There is hyper-reality, which is the defining characteristics of society today, of the truer than true, which he's going to point out that there is basically two extremes to this in the case of visibility, for example, of the more visible than visible and then the more invisible than invisible. But at these approaches to the limits, it no longer really makes sense to talk about an outside. So really, the masses or the social, I think for Baudrillard, he sees it as a weasel word, which doesn't really help us as much as we'd like to, because it doesn't really annul the place that we're in. And I think a really important addition that is made to Baudrillard's work, and Baudrillard makes it especially explicit because, he likes to flirt with these themes of terrorism or pornography, but there is an essential relation to these ideas of the outside of the political, of the vagabonds of ISIS or the Taliban or whatever it may be, which is in fact not really an outside. And we see this, for example, with the role of media communication. The terrorist act becomes an inside. It immediately, so to speak, transfers information which hits us at our very core. But we're in a situation where, for example, with the Israel-Palestine conflict today, Netanyahu and the Israeli government and the IDF can basically violate any Geneva Convention, any notion of war crime imaginable, and nothing is being done about it. Months have ensued, and we've in fact been dumping, we as in the US, and I know other countries as well, but especially the US, have just dumped more money into the IDF and to whatever Netanyahu wants. And the whole reason for this is what I intimated earlier with the notion that terrorism is essentially a ruse insofar as it is co-opted politically, and in fact it is something produced politically. It is a response which is mandated, which is implicated by the way, for example, the US interacts with the Middle East. It's like, of course we have terrorism in the Middle East. If you look at the US, for example, stirring up various Iranian and Afghani extremists as a way to fight the Soviets, for example, in, again, the words or on the aegis of freedom and democracy. And this essentially creates a situation in which Baudrillard says, quote, "It is then inevitable that the state, in keeping with the disappearance of the political scene, arouse a form, at the same time radical and phantasmatic, of contestation. The phantom of terrorism, which plays the same game as it does, and with whom the state draws up a sort of perverse new social contract." So, and this is something Baudrillard points out really well in Symbolic Exchange and Death, which is that any system that is essentially simulacral and that is going to vie for dominance and totalization and optimization, the way we see it in, for example, the kind of global market, or in the case of the US, it's essentially going to operate by creating a boundary, by creating opposition, by creating and co-opting an outside. And this is what happens, right? The state excites and bolsters the growth of terrorism, as we see in the Middle East today, to act as its phantasmatic double, creating a new global order of dissuaded death or revolution. This is basically that cryogenesis that we've talked about, which is what he means by that social contract. It is a form of life which is essentially frozen in place, in which we have no option but to look on in a sense of awe, right? I mean, you look at what's going on in Palestine right now, and I mean, like, it's so funny how it became a kind of a spectacle, like well after, this has been going on since at least 1948, but at the very least since 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, that at that moment, people have all this indignation, but there's an overwhelming sense that we do not have the power as citizens to change what we need to. And that's because we are stultified into feeling that we have this new social contract, which is really a deterrence mechanism, just like the atomic bomb. It is a deterrence mechanism of, oh, the terrorists are over there. Oh, the situation is over there. And what is happening here is Baudrillard says we are now in a society where exchange is becoming more and more improbable, where fewer and fewer things can really be negotiated because the rules for them have been lost, or because exchange, by becoming more generalized, has brought about the emergence of the last objects irreducible to exchange. And these have become the real stakes. So right now, the real stakes are the stuff that can't be accounted for. It's those anomalies which have to be outpaced, so to speak. The new markets which have yet to be penetrated, or the new places which have yet to be democratized or industrialized. Right? We have ways of talking about global politics of industrialized versus unindustrialized nations, of are they a full democracy, a flawed democracy, or some kind of autocracy or totalitarian state. And what happens is the objects that are irreducible to exchange, those become the stakes. And that's what Baudrillard wants to worry about. And Baudrillard says the inexchangeable is the pure object whose power forbids either possessing or exchanging it. It is something very precious that we don't quite know how to get rid of. It burns and isn't negotiable. It can be killed, but it takes revenge. The corpse always plays this role. Beauty, too, and the fetish as well. It has no value, but is priceless. It is an object of no interest, and at the same time absolutely singular, without equivalent, and almost sacred. The hostage has both qualities at the same time. An annulled, abolished, anonymous object, and at the same time absolutely different, exceptional, of high intensity, dangerous, sublime, as dangerous as the terrorist. So, right, these pure objects, they essentially go beyond any traditional notions of exchange and are laden to these abstract, operationalized, symbolic notions of exchange. Right? That's what Baudrillard is doing in Symbolic Exchange and Death, where pure anonymity becomes the symbolic weight of an optimized, functional element of a code, which becomes indifferent to its content. Right? This is why Baudrillard is so critical of the idea of use value, of it no longer even really matters what the thing is that is being exchanged, but rather that it is being reproduced with more fidelity and with more utility and with more optimization. Right? It doesn't matter that the shirt is literally just the word Gucci on it. It can sell for several thousands of dollars. And like, people know this. Like I said in the last lecture, people who buy this kind of stuff, they know that it's not worth as much as it's being sold for in the literal sense. But that is only if we have an idealized notion of worth as something that really exists. Baudrillard is trying to point out that the relativity of worth is in fact what is being contested now. And he says, for all the reasons the hostage is secretly no longer negotiable, precisely because of his absolute convertibility. No situation embodies this paradox to such an extent. Torn from the circuit of exchange, the hostage becomes exchangeable against anything at all. So, right, when exchange becomes boundless, dictated by this abstract law of symbolic exchange, of a universal currency, for example, that is essentially divorced from its materiality, right? We're not on the gold standard anymore, at least in the US. Absolute reproduction ensues, and content doesn't really mean anything, as if this meaning anything meant something objective. That is what Baudrillard is trying to go against. Now, in response to all of this, because I know there's a lot of problematizing in not only Baudrillard, but especially French postmodernists in general, is, okay, what are we going to do from here? What are our fatal strategies, as Baudrillard has titled this work? Well, Baudrillard says, we must remake illusion, rediscover illusion, this power at once immortal and maleficent, to tear the same away from the same, called seduction. Seduction against terror. These are the stakes. There are no others. He says seduction is also falser than false, since it uses signs which are already semblances to make them lose their meaning. It abuses signs and subjects. So here we're trying to abuse the system with its own lures, basically. And obviously this has some fatalistic tendencies. But rather than trying to set up this objective notion of illusion which stands outside the order, we want to make the order elusive to itself in such in a real way where something actually changes by rediscovering, really when he talks about it as immortal, it's always laden within systems. There is always the possibility of playing with this notion of true and false, which, as Baudrillard says, going beyond the false into the absolute abyss of artifice. It's a nice little rhyme scheme for you there. Now, Baudrillard employs some rather interesting logic, which, to me, this is reminiscent of Graham Harman's usage of analogies and metaphors in object-oriented ontology. That there is an essential ambiguity in metaphor which uses a different definition of what it means to be real. Real takes on a more symbolic definition where, there are all kinds of things which aren't material, which are real. Sherlock Holmes is real in a sense, as Deleuze, or not as Deleuze and Guattari, as Graham Harman puts it, because, well, we can talk about him and we can make whole mythoses in literature about him. And in the same sense, Baudrillard is going to play on this notion of the true versus the false, the real versus the unreal, because those binaries are not innocent, and in fact, Baudrillard doesn't want to try to go back to them. He wants to look at the systems that are in place, find their weaknesses where something could be attenuated to our advantage. He says, in the movement of seduction, this also applies to the work of art, it is as if the false were resplendent in all the power of the true. It is as if illusion were resplendent in all the power of truth. No more real, no more meaning holds. When a form is resplendent with inverse energy, when the energy of the false shines with the power of the true, or when the good shines with the energy of evil, and he puts both of those with capital G and E, when instead of setting them in opposition to each other, a kind of singular anamorphosis guides the transpiration of one form into the other, the transpartition of one energy into its inverse, What could one oppose to this singular movement? So really, we have an ambiguous simultaneity only possible in a seductive joke. So Baudrillard is really trying to play with comedy, with an ambiguity that can occur only in a joke, only in a metaphor, only in something which operates on the symbolic realm. And this is not to say it's not any less real. He makes this logic very clear. It is a logic of the simultaneity of inverse effects, which obviously that is not something that can play out except in the notion of the virtual, or the symbolic would be the better way to talk about it, in which we're not violating the law of non-contradiction, but rather we're pointing out the messiness, the ambiguity that rules our structures. And Baudrillard puts this into quite interesting terms when he talks about gaming in the sense of in casinos. And Baudrillard points out that there is a centrality of obscenity, which is in society. And sometimes, again, this appears a little bit conservative when he talks about, for example, the obscenity of porn. But he says that the obscenity of gaming is total because there is no longer any appeal to any depth or value whatsoever. Here, money is naked, metamorphosed into pure circulation, pure fascination, formal passion, transparent, cold, and superficial jouissance. Disembodied lewdness, the ecstatic form of value. That's right, it's that sense of circulation which has no reference to anything outside the system. It's a purely internally coded logic. And he goes on, but the secret of gaming is also total. It is that money does not exist. It is like the secret of power, that there is none, or that of seduction, that desire does not exist. Money exists neither as essence, nor as substance, nor as value, and gaming returns it to its inexistence. And it's important that we focus on what he means by existence here. Because, of course, the way we talk about ontology, it's often at its most ambiguous when we use the word exist versus is or is not, or terms like negate, for example. But what he means here is that there is no outside in the sense of some idealized outside reference. Because it is important to mention, and this is really the whole buildup of this chapter, is that this is a post-representationalist model, just like Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari, when they're talking about, for example, the unconscious, they're trying to get rid of these notions of the Oedipus complex, which were spawned by Freud, or indeed penis envy, or the phallus as conceived by Lacan, of ridding ourselves of these idealized notions of the unconscious conditions which apply to all unconsciouses before any social interactions. In the same sense, Baudrillard is trying to look at value or power or desire. And when he says, for example, that desire does not exist, or that the secret of power is that there is none, what he's trying to say is that there is no outside and we shouldn't be looking for one. Because if we do, we fall into these rather naive, often neoliberal notions of justice or progress, which can be co-opted by various populist movements, for example, with Donald Trump today, which essentially serves to act as a code which circulates in the void. But the fact that it's in a void, the fact that there is no idealized outside, that we're in an ontology of relation and difference in interaction, this is really the appeal here. And he points out that these are, quote, arbitrary rules of the game. But that doesn't mean that they're not there because they're arbitrary. They are, in fact, here. The rules and the ways in which we interact, they're very much there, even on the social level. But Baudrillard says the secret of gaming is that money has no meaning. It exists only as appearance. There, the substance of value is volatilized by the play of appearances, by the arbitrariness of play. If money can self-generate so insanely, just as numbers can be multiplied by a simple mental operation, it is possible only because it does not exist. It's like in the game where one is supposed to memorize as many words as possible. You get much further when you forget the meaning of the words. So Baudrillard wants us to give up meaning or value in some objective sense of we have some outside referential. Because if we do that, then we fall into the trap. And for example, we see this in like post-colonial studies. Dr. Deborah Heikes did a great book called Rationality, Representation, and Race, where she talks about, for example, the notion of rationality and how this has been used in race science or in countering women's suffrage to basically denote who is a rational subject, who deserves to be treated as a subject under the law, so to speak. And how we consider this notion of rationality something objective, something that is so common sense that we don't need to think about that. But Baudrillard points out in this very work that those common sense notions are actually the most fuzzy and the ones that have been co-opted by the system the most. And in the situation of colonialism, for example, this serves to, these people aren't as rational. We need to show them the stuff that they couldn't come up with on their own, such as democracy, which is just, it's so backward, and it's something that Deleuze and Guattari really look at when basically upholding the notion of the nomad over the modern state. And this is something that Baudrillard is trying to put into words here, which is that there is no idealized objectivity outside, which is the basically pure form of justice or meaning or value or desire. Instead, we have a model based off of play, and we have to figure out how to play by those rules and basically fatalize those rules, take advantage of them. And Baudrillard continues to talk about this insistence on meaning, for example, and he talks about the co-option of the idea of something being retro, and the way this essentially romanticizes history by making it be true, by giving it some reductive sense of truth. He says this really is exaction. You expel things into the real and force them to mean something. But perhaps things are never true, quote unquote, except at this price, being led under too garish a light with too high a standard of fidelity. So, right, this notion of truth in the historical sense of being able to capture fully what was going on, or in the sense of taking place in history, of being able to reduce something to a moment, this essentially creates a situation where Baudrillard says that entire charming little music of meaning has passed into the stereophony of signals which lulls us to sleep. And this is very remnant of Nietzsche's Last Man, of we think we've solved all the problems, and in fact that means the problems have only compounded on top of us, which leads to what Baudrillard calls an outrageous socialization, the rampant obscenity of uninterrupted social commentary. I think that little quote just rings very true today. And continuing on this notion of essentially solicited identity, Baudrillard says solicitation, sensitivization, being plugged in, targeted, contact, connection. All this terminology is that of a white obscenity, one of dejection and uninterrupted abjection. This is the obscenity of change, of this ferocious fluidity of signs and values, of this total extroversion of behavior into the operational, the white and impersonal objectivity of polls and statistics, the masses having to reveal their secrets, even if they don't have any. Everyone must deliver his secret, cross the threshold of silence, and enter the imminent space of communication. So, right, we've got this notion today of like telling your story, or of being heard, of being recognized, of having a super niche community which can fully accept you without any retribution, without any conflict. So there's really a solicited operational imperative of contact and publicity that flatters the social into a domain of universal subjectification, right? You have to mean something. Something can't be ambiguous. And Baudrillard points out that we've got this process of essentially stripping the body of appearances, of making it completely operational, of subjecting it completely. But it must be pointed out, and I was a little bit skeptical of what Baudrillard's thoughts were until I got this quote, and this is on page 84, by the way, of the semiotext edition, just because I think it's that important to cite specifically. But Baudrillard qualifies that this moment of absolute abjection, of being totally coded over, of being essentially nothing but the one, this universalized concept, that would be impossible. He says, it is doubtless impossible to strip a body or a face totally of its appearances and yield it up to the pure concupiscence of looking, to strip it of its aura and yield to it the pure concupiscence of desire, to strip it of its secret and yield to the pure operation of decipherment. And especially that last part, we can get really close to totalization such that the distance doesn't really matter, like he's talked about with obesity, where it just becomes a passage at the limits that the metric becomes rather, think about the way currencies inflate today. It doesn't even really matter the rate as long as we're keeping up with it. But there's always a little bit of secret. There's always something left which hasn't yielded. And that's really important. And Baudrillard points out something really funny about porn, but I think it is interesting. He says, porn basically says, there is good sex somewhere since I am its caricature. There is some measure since I am its excess. But this is precisely the question. Is there good sex somewhere? Sex as an ideal value of the body? As a quote-unquote desire that must be liberated? The virtual state of things, that of total explicitness of sex, answers no. Sex can be perfectly liberated, perfectly transparent without desire and without pleasure. It still functions. So, right, by surpassing the ideal and making it into a caricature, it banalizes its referent, the quote-unquote real, to the point that it's a pure copy without an original. And this is simulacra in its essence. And it's important to note that this is essentially a post-representationalist view of the real, quote-unquote, of what desire really means. And what he's saying here is rather actually similar to Deleuze and Guattari. This notion of a desire that must be liberated, of the desire everyone really wants, that is of course a fiction because, right, we're not all the same. We have completely different desires and desire acts on us in completely different ways. And if we presuppose some ideal form of the value of the body, of what people want, quote unquote, of what you, quote unquote, really want, well, that's a situation where there is no real sex. And that's what Baudrillard means. Not that there isn't like the real act of having sex. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is porn seems like a caricature, but in fact, it can be just as real as quote unquote real sex. It can still function, but you can take all the desire and the pleasure out of it. And he asks, as a result, and this is really his anti-idealist stuff made explicit. He asks, is there some good substance to the social, some ideality of social relationship that can and should be liberated? The answer is obviously no. The equilibrium and harmony of a certain social contract has disappeared over the horizon of history, and we are doomed to this diaphanous obscenity of change. We mustn't believe we are living the realization of some evil utopia. We are living the realization of utopia, period. That is to say, its collapse into the real. And he goes on to say, by virtue of machines, artifact, technique, and counterfeit, the real is challenged according to its own real rules. So that is what is at stake. That is our fatal strategy, is the real being challenged by its own rules. And we're not seeking some outside, because, and this is what Baudrillard means when he talks about the answer being induced by the question, in the sense of the poll or the election, is the outside, in terms of, the outside is something we have to get to. It's some sort of reference of real meaning, of real value, is equally defined and solicited by what the inside is. The way we are ruled and the sort of paths we are given of how we interact control the sort of ideals which we are searching for. Maybe it's pleasure. Maybe it's being heard. Maybe it's really mattering or not being alienated. Baudrillard is trying to problematize these and say, look, if you succumb to this notion of a human spirit that everyone has in common and we're all going towards this same rational goal which is played out in history, we essentially drop the ball and we let ourselves be put in chains and we let ourselves basically run in place. So there is no original or pure desire or subjectivity or value that stands behind things. There is no what you really want. We have our games, and we must know their rules. And by knowing their rules, we can challenge those rules. And Baudrillard makes explicit the notion of, quote, the end of representation, and re-injecting it by virtue of cruelty with something prior even to illusion and simulacrum, something of the savage operation of sign upon reality. And he's taking this from Artaud, but we're essentially mocking representation by caricaturing it, by fatalizing it, by seducing it with some sort of an illusion. And this insistence on the real has basically led to the infiltration of ourselves by the simulacrum, by this boundless double that is proliferating. And Baudrillard points out two different forms of the obscene, and I think this is perhaps one of the challenges that we can put against Baudrillard is really set on operating within the rules of the game, just like Deleuze and Guattari are. Deleuze and Guattari, too, they want to play with the rules of the assemblage, and they want to find our lines of flight and look at the stuff that can't be coded, the parts of us that can't be absorbed by the state, the stuff of us that can still become nomad. But for Baudrillard, he really focuses on a more nihilistic, fatalistic notion, not of revolution, but of comedy and caricature. I think Baudrillard would see revolution as being too invested by this kind of liberal idealist notion of, this utopia that we're going to get to. And Baudrillard is not really utopian in a certain sense, whereas Deleuze and Guattari explicitly state in A Thousand Plateaus this kind of utopia that they're aimed at, but in a very novel sense, in my opinion. But Baudrillard points out two different versions of the obscene. And he says, the obscene is what is neither visible nor representable, and thus possesses an energy of rupture, of transgression, and a hidden violence. This is traditional obscenity, of the sexually or socially repressed, of what is neither represented nor representable. This is kind of the subaltern in Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's words, so to speak. It is something which is not codable. It's something which is not representable and thus doesn't have a voice in the traditional sense, that cannot speak, as Spivak would put it. But as plenty of other philosophers like Homi Bhabha point out, for example, that this uncodability, the fact that there is some undecidable electric flow which defines their rupture potentials, their transgressive potentials, this is their power. And Baudrillard points out explicitly, the idea of being sexually repressed, for example. And I think of the talks over whether or not prostitution is something that is revolutionary or whether it is kind of precluding some sort of, or rather acquiescing to some sort of ideal of some sort of like, oh, you think you're fighting for your liberation, but actually you're just succumbing to your subjection. And in that, you've got this notion of repression as something which is a step on the way to liberation. It means that you can't be totalized, that you serve some kind of threat. But Baudrillard says, to highlight the second type, he says it's otherwise for us, meaning us today in contemporary society. Obscenity today is, on the contrary, that of over-representation. Our own radical obscenity is no longer that of the hidden and the repressed, it's the transparency of the social itself, emergence of the social and of sex as meaning, reference, evidence. So I think this is hinging on his ideas before of being solicited to have an identity, of being forced to, being repressed is something that is trying to be taken out of society in the sense of, oh, you deserve a platform, you deserve a voice. And I think Baudrillard would say that by giving them a voice, essentially no one really has a voice. The voice, in terms of what someone can really say, of really mattering to society, that is an obscenity in and of itself, which highlights that sense of over-representation. But I think Baudrillard is clearly aware that that first obscenity is still possible, insofar as he was very explicit earlier about saying that it's impossible to strip the subject of its secret and yield to it the pure operation of decipherment. That there's something uncodable still there. So I think he's aware of that, but I think he's just not choosing to focus on that as explicitly. And Baudrillard, he's fighting against this idealist, really enlightenment kind of romantic sense of progress, of rationality, of history as a dialectical process, of utopia, of value as something independent of a system. And he says everything obscene is a matter of surface, but there are no more secrets beneath these superficies. What was kept secret, or even what didn't exist, found itself expelled forcibly into the real, represented beyond all necessity and all resemblance. Forcing of representation. As with porn, an orgasm in color and close-up is neither necessary nor convincing. It is merely implacably true, even if it is the truth of nothing at all. It is only abjectly visible, even if it represents nothing at all. So, this notion of visibility becomes essentially forced. It becomes a question of abjection, which makes things make sense, such that we essentially beat the pulp out of meaning, such that it doesn't really mean anything. And Baudrillard is like, this is okay. We should get out of this notion of something really meaning something, of something which really represents something. Instead, we should see, well, how are these strategies co-opted? How are they used in society? How can we caricature them? How can we turn them into a comedy? He says we are exposed to an over-representation of these things by the media, but still we can't really imagine them. All of that for us is simply obscene, since images in the media are made to be seen but not really looked at. Hallucinated in silhouette, absorbed, like sex absorbs the voyeur, from a distance. Neither spectators nor actors, we are voyeurs without illusion. So because representations are paraded without a referent, there is no true value or image or even truth with a capital T. We are reduced to essentially witnessing a benign reality, right? We look at all the stuff that's on the news and apathy is the state of contemporary society, even more than in Baudrillard's day. We are desensitized by the amount of school shootings, and this is something abhorrent to every single American, and yet still we have these abstract notions, for example, of liberty, which are at work in misreadings of the Second Amendment, which continue to uphold this notion of absolute liberty when it comes for guns, but not, for example, with women's bodily autonomy. And the contradiction is there, but we just can't really do anything about it, right? It just seems like Roe v. Wade got overturned or what have you, and there was nothing we could do about it. And he really sums up the media, journalists, and the news very well when he calls them pornographers of indifference whose official obscenity redoubles and calls attention to the obscenity of a world without illusion. Furthermore, nobody cares. We are in the ecstasy of the political and the historical, perfectly formless and impotent, in perfect solidarity yet paralyzed, perfectly frozen in a worldwide stereophonic complex, transpoliticized, alive. So this is an impotence that comes from overexposure, right? We are in perfect solidarity with the Palestinian people. We are in perfect solidarity with, think about anything that is used as kind of a weasel word in modern politics. We are in solidarity, and yet we are essentially cryogenic, paralyzed, frozen. We're stuck in, I think the idea of a stereophonic complex is really interesting, focusing on those auditory imageries of essentially being trans-politicized, of being trans-social, of basically being able to be everywhere at once, which essentially turns us into a dead commodity. But we are so while we are alive. And in terms of the commodity, he says the obscenity of the commodity comes from its abstraction, formal and light, against the weight and density of the object. The commodity is readable, contrary to the object which never confesses completely its secret. The commodity manifests always its visible essence, which is its price. It is the formal place of transcription of all possible objects. Through it, they all communicate. It is the first great medium of communication of the modern world. But the message it delivers is extremely simplified, and it's always the same. It is exchange value. Basically, therefore, the message already no longer exists. It's the medium that imposes itself in its pure circulation. And this is a really great way of thinking of hyperreality in Baudrillard's work, of the realer than real, which is exchange value, which is basically this element of a simulacrum, of a copy without an original, which essentially runs the world today, which is the economy of the ever-increasing need to survive, which is bolstered by a workaholic culture and optimization of workforce and stuff like this. And it essentially happens when the commodity becomes circulated not by use value, but by exchange value. It becomes merely a question of price, of money, of being able to communicate across all lines through a universal sense of currency, for example. And this abstract insistence on objective exchange, fees exchange value, is invalid in a movement of pure commutability and circularity. When you have instantaneous conjunction, when something can stand in for something else, like the case of the hostage, we essentially have this transpolitical circular movement in the void, which leads to what Baudrillard deems as a schizophrenic condition. And he says that what characterizes this schizophrenic, which really is the last figure of the transpolitical, Baudrillard says what characterizes him is less his light years distance from the real, a radical break, than absolute proximity. The total instantaneousness of things, defenseless with no retreat, end of interiority and intimacy, overexposure and transparency of the world that traverses him without his being able to interpose any barrier. For he can no longer produce the limits of his own being and reflect himself. He is only an absorbent screen, a spinning and insensible plate for all the networks of influence. So I hope this has been useful in getting a look at Baudrillard's work. Fatal Strategies is a really interesting work, really complex, filled with lots of kind of comical elements, which I think make it a really exciting read. But I obviously don't agree with everything Baudrillard says. I think his project at times is aimed at parody in a way that is merely subversive for subversive's sake. And Baudrillard likes that. And I kind of like that he likes that. But also I think that sometimes it is obviously fatalistic and sometimes inadequate for solving something without some sort of explosive strategy, which I think is just problematic to my likes of my life, for example, which maybe exemplifies rather well the stultifying condition of contemporary society. So I hope this has been useful for getting a look at Baudrillard. Watch my other lectures that I've done on Baudrillard's thought to kind of contextualize this more. I also do a lot of work on postmodernism and German idealism and feminism and post-colonial studies. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.